Welcome to the Passion of the Christ in Art, an exploration for Lent groups for Chingford Parish, in which we're exploring the events of the last week of Christ's earthly life through the work of artists in the Western tradition over the last 900 years. The first week we looked at Stanley Spencer's Last Supper from 1922, and last week we looked at Giotto's fresco, The Arrest of Christ, from the Arena Chapel in the very early part of the 14th century. We would have had to travel to go and see those paintings in real life, the Spencer being at the Cookham Spencer Memorial Gallery in the Thames Valley, and the Arena Chapel being in Padua in Italy. We wouldn't have so far to travel to look at today's painting, Gerrit von Honthorst's Christ Before the High Priest, which is exhibited in the National Gallery in London. Gerrit von Honthorst was born in Utrecht on the 4th of November, either 1590 or 1592. He's known in Italy as Gerardo della Notte or della Noti, and both his father and grandfather were artists. His grandfather, Gerrit Huygens, was the dean of the Utrecht Guild of Artists in 1579, and his father, Herman Gerrit, was a painter of tapestry cartoons. It was a family business. Gerrit studied under Abraham Bleumart in Utrecht, and then in about 1610 went to Rome and remained there for 10 years. I need to say something about Utrecht and the nature and the character of it. Utrecht, smack in the centre of what is now the Netherlands, what's commonly called Holland in English, had its origins as a Roman fortification in the 1st century AD, built on the River Rhine. And in that period, in the Roman period, as a frontier fortification, it was a very small town of about 500 Roman soldiers with civilian encampment around, a settlement around it. We don't know very much about Utrecht's history between 270 or 500, but after that period, in the 6th century, it came under the influence of the Franks. During the Middle Ages, Utrecht was the most important city of the northern Netherlands. Willibrord was its first bishop. He was appointed Archbishop of the Frisians in 695, and in the early part of the 8th century, Pepin II of Herstal gave him Utrecht as a see for his missionary activities. Utrecht became a fully fledged city in 1122. The bishops of Utrecht exercised a worldly power, not just in the province of Utrecht, known as Niedersticht, but also further to the northeast. In 1528, so 90 years or so before Gerrit's adult life, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had his interactions with Henry VIII of England, became Lord of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, the current Benelux countries, and also including the north of France. There's Utrecht, smack in the middle of the modern-day Netherlands. Interestingly enough, Utrecht has a long tradition of artists coming from there, and probably the most famous artist from Utrecht of the 20th century is Hendrik Magdalenus Brunner, better known as Dick Brunner, who died in 2017 at the age of 90. Dick Brunner, famous for his Miffy Rabbit children's books, was born, lived and died in Utrecht. We call that part of the world Holland, but Holland is just one of the many provinces that made up the Spanish-controlled, the Habsburg-controlled Netherlands in the 17th century. In 1579, the northern 7 provinces of the Low Countries, which is what Netherlands means, signed the Union of Utrecht, and they decided to work together against Spanish rule. And this is usually seen as the beginning of the Dutch Republic. In 1580, the predominantly Protestant state abolished bishoprics, including the one in Utrecht, and only in 1853 was the see reinstated. So the United Provinces, the northern part of the Netherlands, versus the Spanish Netherlands, which became Belgium, Protestant versus Catholic, as a consequence and outworking of the Reformation. But Gerrit von Honthorst had gone off to Rome. Now, we tend to think of Rome as being grand always, grand as it was during the height of the Augustan Caesars and grand as it was during the height of the late 17th and 18th century. But you have to remember that at the beginning of the 17th century, Rome was recovering from centuries of depopulation and destruction. And that recovery only reached its height in the second half of the 17th century with the art and architecture movement that was later called the Baroque. Now, for the Baroque, contrast, movement and detail as exuberant as possible, colour, grandeur and surprise, all designed to lead to a sense of awe. It's an interesting word, and nobody really knows the etymology of it. Perhaps some scholars have said it comes from the Portuguese baroque, meaning a flawed pearl, which in turn comes from the Latin verruca, meaning a wart. Or perhaps it's from the Latin philosophical term barocco, meaning anything uselessly complicated. If so, then it was an insult which became a badge of honour. But remember that baroque is a term that is applied by later historians and art critics to an earlier period. Von Honthorst didn't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to paint a Baroque picture. He didn't realise that that's what he was doing. You can see some of the effects of the later Baroque in the architecture that is still recognisable in Rome. Here is Codazzi's painting of St. Peter's from about 1630, which is in the Prado. But you can also see the desolation of Rome from that period as well. Claude Lorraine, who was a French painter, in the mid-17th century painted this picture of the Roman Forum with many of what is now the most famous monuments half buried by debris. And if you ever go to the Roman Forum, you can see these enormous arches and columns standing 30, 40, 50 feet high, which were 3/4 buried by the debris of centuries there. A lot of Rome in the early 17th century was camping out amidst the ruins, and the countryside was part and parcel of the city. This is the ruins of the city walls near the Porta San Paolo from 1625. One of the most important artists in Rome in this period, and one of the most important influences upon von Honthorst, is this guy, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. Very often simply just called Caravaggio. This is a portrait of him from about 1621, drawn by Ottavio Leone. Caravaggio was probably born in about 1571, probably in Milan, and he died in 1610 at Portecole in Tuscany. He was a painter who developed a revolutionary technique of tenebrism, or dramatic selective illumination of form out of deep shadow, which became a hallmark of Baroque painting. He radically scorned the idealization of religious subjects, and he took his models from the streets and painted them realistically. Models who were modelling the role of the great saints and heroes of the Christian faith. His 3 paintings of St. Matthew from about 1597 to 1602 caused a sensation, and they were followed by such masterpieces as the Supper at Emmaus and the Death of the Virgin. This is one of the 3 paintings of the Calling of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi de' Francesi in Rome, about 150 yards from the office where I used to work. If you go to the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi de' Francesi and you pray for the head of state of France, then apparently you get some days off in purgatory. And a colleague of mine always ostentatiously used to go in there and pray for the Queen, asserting as he did that the Queen was still the crowned head of France and the Republic had no right for that kind of purgatorial praying. But anyway, that's a by the by. Here you can see how in the early beginning of the 17th century that realism had won over from the fashionable style of the previous 50 years, which has been called mannerism. Caravaggio's realistic naturalism is displayed in his paintings here completely. He was only 24 when he was commissioned to paint these pictures, and it gave him a status as a pictor celebrimus, a renowned painter. He was asked to paint 3 large paintings as scenes from Matthew's life: Matthew and the Angel, the Calling of St. Matthew, and the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. Caravaggio used a dramatic contemporary realism, and it provoked public astonishment. Perhaps, as the Webb Gallery of Art says, Caravaggio was waiting for this test, on public view at last, to reveal the whole range of his diversity. His novelty in these works not only involves the surface appearance of structure and subject, but also the sense of light and even of time. The first version of the canvas that was to go over the altar, St. Matthew and the Angel, was so offensive to the canons of San Luigi di Francesi, who had never seen such a representation of the saint, that it had to be redone, because the evangelist had the physical features of a ploughman or a common labourer. His big feet seemed to stick out of the picture, and his posture, legs crossed, is awkward, almost to the point of vulgarity. What the canons didn't understand was that Caravaggio, in elevating this humble figure, was copying Christ, who had himself raised Matthew from the street. The Calling of St. Matthew shows the moment at which 2 men in the 2 worlds confront each other. Christ, in a burst of light, entering the room of the toll collector, and Matthew, intent on counting coins, in the midst of a group of gaily dressed idlers with swords at their sides. And in the glance between the 2 men, Matthew's world is dissolved. The brilliant thing about this painting is that the way that it's situated on the side wall of a chapel is that the window is of the chapel, the physical window of the chapel is in the top right-hand corner of the painting. So the light that comes through from the street falls onto the painting in exactly the same way that Caravaggio had painted the light in his depiction. Art and real life combining. In the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, the event is captured just at the moment when the executioner is forcing his victim to the ground. It's a public street. Matthew's followers flee in terror. Passers-by glance at the act with idle unconcern. It almost looks as if they're being performed in thick darkness, when a sudden illumination reveals them and fixes them in the memory of their most intense drama. These paintings caused a sensation in Rome and marked a radical change in Caravaggio's artistic preoccupations. But he didn't build upon that because Caravaggio's temper was way too short. In April 1604, he was accused of throwing a plate of artichokes in the face of a waiter. And in October, he was arrested for throwing stones at the Roman guards. In May 1605, he was seized for a misuse of arms, and by July of that year, he had to flee Rome for a time because he had wounded a man in defence of his mistress. Within a year, in May 1606, again in Rome, during a furious brawl over a disputed score in a game of tennis, Caravaggio killed a man, Ranuccio Tomassoni, and he took flight and hid in Malta and Naples and other places. The only way that he could come back to Rome, the centre of religious and artistic patronage, was when if he could have a pardon from the Pope. In Naples in October 1609, he was attacked in his inn and wounded so badly that rumours reached Rome that he had died. But he recovered enough to sail from Naples to Rome, but was arrested en route when his boat made a stop on the coast. He tried to overtake the vessel after he got released from the arrest, but he arrived at Porticoli, Spanish possession, and he died there a few days later, probably of pneumonia, and he only received clemency in a document which arrived from Rome 3 days after his death. But that was Caravaggio. What about Gerrit von Honthorst? One of his great paintings, which caused a sensation for him in Rome, is the beheading of John the Baptist, which was painted for and is displayed still in Santa Maria della Scala in Trastevere, on the what was then the unfashionable working class bank of the Tiber, but now is a major tourist area as well. And this painting really made von Honthorst's name in Rome and set him up as somebody who could return to Utrecht as a renowned painter himself. By October 1620 he had returned to Utrecht, and he married that month. He became a member of the Utrecht Guild in 1622 and was its dean in 1625, 1626, 28 and 29. Whilst he was in Holland, he painted few religious pictures, and he turned to classical and Arcadian subjects, even more to genre and portraits, in which the influence of some of his Utrecht contemporaries is also discernible. His fame was soon widespread. He came to England for about 9 months, painted a huge painting for Charles I, which is in Hampton Court Palace, and was given a pension of £100 a year for that single business trip. Joachim von Sandhart, German painter, came to study with him in 1625, and at that point he had 25 pupils, each of whom paid him 100 guilders a year. Von Honthorst was prosperously secure, and he carried on painting the pictures that using the techniques that he had learnt and had been so influential in Rome. Here is his a painting from the Prodigal Son series, which is in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. It was seen that von Honthorst was a member of the Caravaggisti, those who followed Caravaggio. A later artist and historian, Giovanni Pietro Bellori, in his book The Lives of Modern Painters, Sculptors and Architects from 1672, said this about the Caravaggisti. Painters then in Rome were greatly taken by this novelty, and the young ones particularly gathered around him Caravaggio, praised him as the unique imitator of nature, and looked upon his work as miracles. They outdid each other in imitating his works, undressing their models and raising their lights. That's one of the Prodigal Son paintings, which is in Munich. Another one of the Prodigal Son paintings is in the Staatsgalerie in Schleißheim. But this wasn't necessarily well regarded all the way through history. Encyclopaedia Britannica from 1911 said that Honthorst exchanged the style of the Frankens for that of the pseudo-Italians at the beginning of the 16th century. Infected thus early with a mania which came to be very general in Holland, Honthorst copied the naturalism and eccentricities of Michelangelo da Caravaggio. Charles I, whose taste was flattered alike by the energy of Rubens and the elegance of Van Dyck, was thus first captivated by the fanciful mediocrity of Honthorst, who, though a poor executant, had luckily for himself caught, as Lord Arundel said, much of the manner of our Caravaggio's colouring, then so much esteemed at Rome. It was his habit to transmute every subject into a night scene, from the Nativity, for which there was warrant in the example of Correggio, to the penitence of the Magdalene, for which there was no warrant at all. But unhappily in this caprice, though sublime in Allegri and Rembrandt, was but a phantasm in the hands of Honthorst. His prosaic pencil was not capable of more than vulgar utterances, and art gained little from the repetition of these quaint vagaries. Remember, what we think of as a masterpiece, earlier generations or later generations might think of them as being no more than vulgar utterances. This is von Honthorst's Adoration of the Shepherds from about 1622, which is an oil painting which is in the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne. 20th century and later art historians are more generous to von Honthorst than the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 120 years ago. Neil McLaren, in his book The Dutch School, published for the National Gallery, says, Honthorst was one of the few Dutch painters of his day who was an international figure. He was one of the principal channels, though not the earliest, through which Caravaggio's innovations reached Holland, and he popularised candle-lit scenes. Although you'll note here, there is no candle, and that the scene is lit by the person of the infant Christ alone. Here is Honthorst's picture of the Denial of St. Peter from about 1623, an oil painting which is in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. Joneath Spicer and Lynn Federal Orr, in their book Masters of Light, Dutch Painters in Utrecht During the Golden Age, say of this painting, the essence of Caravaggesque religious painting is drama, physical and psychological. In the hands of Honthorst, that usually meant theatrical lighting to illuminate his relatively stationary figures, accentuating both salient gestures and facial expressions. Relying on neither dramatic movement nor grand rhetorical gestures, Honthorst imbued his religious compositions with a quiet solidity in keeping with the gravity of their subject matter. Not much is really happening here, but it is beautifully lit. Which brings us to our painting for today. Neil McLaren says that on the back of the lining of the canvas of this painting is the cipher of the Duke of Lucca. Where did it come from? Where was it painted? And who owned it? According to Sandat, the picture was painted in Rome for the Marchese Giustiniana, in whose house Honthorst had lived. Some scholars date it to about 1617, so shortly before he painted the beheading of St. John the Baptist in Santa Maria della Scala. And this became one of the more celebrated paintings in Rome. Numerous copies were made of it. There are copies in, amongst other places, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Bordeaux Cathedral, Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, San Andrea della Valle in Rome, the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, and Rouen Museum. It was in the Giustiniana Palace until about 1804, where it was bought by Lucien Bonaparte, and it was sold by him in 1820 to Maria Luisa, Duchess of Lucca, and was exhibited in the Royal Palace in Lucca. And then it was sold by her son Carlo Ludovico at the Society of Painters in Watercolours in London in July 1840, and was bought by the Duke of Sutherland, and was kept in his house, Stafford House in London. And it was sold by the Fourth Duke's Art Collections in 1913 and bought by Jones Brothers, who were art dealers, for 65 guineas. It was purchased by the National Gallery from the Art Collectors Association in 1922. The National Gallery does have a letter from a Mr. R.H. Ward, who was the manager of the Art Collectors Association in 1922, and recalled that the painting, number 3679, was purchased by my elder brother A.G. Holsapple Ward at Foster's Auction Rooms, Pall Mall, for £14. It was on the floor, wrapped around the stretcher, and I had it put together and offered to the National Gallery, who purchased it from me for £250. Sir Charles Holmes told me afterwards that he had been reproached for buying a poor picture. In actual fact, other correspondence shows that the price paid by the National Gallery for it was £200. £200 for something which is now priceless. Joachim von Sandrart described the subject as Christ before Pilate. And this has been repeated by many subsequent writers, that is Pilate, who is sat on the left-hand side interrogating Jesus, standing on the right, the other side of a single candle. But all the Gospel accounts make it clear that Christ appeared before Pilate in the daytime, while from three of them, Matthew, Mark and John, it emerges that he was taken before the high priest at night. But which high priest? The Gospels do not agree about which high priest interrogated Jesus and when. Matthew says that Christ was tried before the high priest Caiaphas. Mark doesn't mention the high priest's name, and Luke doesn't mention the high priest's name. John says that Christ was tried by Annas, whom he describes as the high priest, and then sent to the high priest Caiaphas, although there is no mention of a Caiaphas interrogation. before we look at the face of the high priest and Christ, let's look at these two people in the background. Neil McLaren says the two men standing apart from the others perhaps indicate the two false witnesses which are mentioned in Matthew's Gospel alone. So Neil McLaren thinks that this is Matthew's account of the interrogation. From Matthew 26, verses 57 to 65. Those who arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the high priest and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy." It could be that this is Honthorst's painting of the Matthew interrogation, but if so, when in the interrogation? Have the two witnesses, if these are the two false witnesses, have they given their testimony, or are they preparing themselves to give their testimony? Did they know that it was false, or did they think that they were telling the truth? The ambiguity of the features of the subjects here is matched by the ambiguity of the light that Honthorst has chosen to depict the occasion in. John Drury disagrees that this was Matthew's Gospel. He said that a nocturnal trial was a good subject from Honthorst. Using the light of a single candle centrally placed, Honthorst achieves an image of haunting power and simplicity. The verse illustrated is John 18, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. In the New Revised Standard Version it goes, "The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. John Drury goes on to say, describing the way that Honthorst has painted the high priest, "From his wide open eyes he gazes at Jesus over the tip of his raised finger. It is brightly lit, as is the book of law below, which gives him a legal armoury of chapters and verses for his interrogation. Jesus listens to him with serious but easy attention, his lips parted for his calm reply, I spake openly to the world. In secret I have said nothing. Why askest thou me?" The white robe which follows the relaxed pose of his body and is rich with the play of light, is falling from his shoulder, but his bound hands do not move to adjust it. Honthorst's contrast between the high priest's volubility and the quietness of his prisoner will remind readers of Dostoevsky in his fable of the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov. There, Jesus' quietness is made into complete silence. The Inquisitor goes on at Jesus for 10 closely argued pages, insistent on the disaster which his offer of freedom will bring upon weak and irresponsible humanity, which rightly prefers to live in obedience to the Church and its order. And John Drury goes on to quote from the Brothers Karamazov, but before I do, just a small warning. The Brothers Karamazov was written 200 years after von Honthorst painted this picture. Remember what possibly the order of influence might be. It certainly isn't von Honthorst himself reflecting on the Brothers Karamazov. But even so, this is what Dostoevsky wrote. When the inquisitor finished speaking, he waited for some time for the prisoner's reply. His silence distressed him. He saw that the prisoner had been listening to him intently all the time, looking gently into his face and evidently not wishing to say anything in reply. The old man would have liked him to say something, however bitter and terrible, but he suddenly approached the old man and kissed him gently on his bloodless, aged lips. That was all his answer. John Drury goes on to say, the patient sympathy with which Christ gazes at his interrogator in Honthorst's picture suggests that Honthorst's meditations on St. John's Gospel had led him a little way along the line of thought which Dostoevsky took to the electrifying point of that kiss. Amongst the many copies of this popular and influential picture, there had been one in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg since 1831. From 1850 it was on view to the public. There is no record, only the lively possibility of Dostoevsky seeing it. Like Dostoevsky, who had the Gospels with him when he was a prisoner in Siberia, Honthorst has read St. John well. It is a remarkable feature of the story of Christ's Passion in that book that Jesus seems to suffer less than his restless accusers and judges. He is majestically in control, firm in the confidence of alone knowing what it is happening and its divine inevitability. The two figures, lit by one candle, realize St. John's contrast unforgettably. Next week, we'll be looking at the events immediately after Jesus' interrogation by the high priest, namely the crucifixion. And we'll be looking at the crucifixion in the work of Marc Chagall, the crucifixion from the point of view of a Jewish artist, and a crucifixion which is not happening 2,000 years ago in a safely isolated place, but a crucifixion which is happening right in the middle of the artist's life. Note the date when white crucifixion was painted. Thank you very much for your presence, and join us next week when we look at Chagall's White Crucifixion.